Okay, I'm Scott Wallsten. I'll be moderating this panel. Harold asked me to give a brief introduction about secondary spectrum markets, and so I'll do that, and then have Karl and Frederick discuss the paper, and then we'll go down for comments, for discussion about the paper, and then for questions. So briefly, secondary markets. What are they? It's not always obvious what exactly is a secondary market and what isn't. It's generally a market that involves a sale by something other than the original owner or maker of the product. It's not always, there's not always a clear line between the primary market and the secondary one. In Spectrum, that line is also not completely clear. There are companies like Core Telematics and Jasper Wireless that aggregate network use by the providers and then resell it to primarily machine-to-machine use. So that's a secondary market in the sense that they're reselling someone else's network use, network services. But generally, when we're talking about secondary spectrum markets, it means selling a license or leasing a license by someone who is not, to someone who is not, by someone who is possibly the original licensee to someone who is not the original licensee. So it's not coming directly from the government. The spectrum auctions, that's sort of the primary sale of a spectrum license. And then a secondary market is if that licensee then sells it or leases it to someone else. And that's generally what we talk about. Generally what people mean in secondary spectrum markets. That's what we mean here. Why is it important? Well, over the last couple of decades, we've talked a lot about spectrum auctions, the idea being that you want to make sure that spectrum goes to the highest value of use and that auctions are designed properly can do that. Other people have other ideas of how you might initially make sure that the initial allocations are efficient, but those are still only about the initial allocations. Supply and demand conditions change over time, and you want to make sure that spectrum continues to go to the highest value of use. And whatever mechanism you use to allocate spectrum initially, you want to make sure that it can change over time. And secondary markets are one way that it can do that. The spectrum licenses can change hands, if you can lease it, if you can aggregate it, and disaggregate it in all different ways. If this were to work smoothly, this would be a way to make sure that spectrum continues to be used efficiently. Now, the FCC started down the path of secondary markets, truly started down the path in 2000 when it set forth five features that they believed that had to be present for a secondary market to work well. They had to have clearly defined economic rights of licenses. You had to have full information on prices and products. You had to have mechanisms to bring buyers and sellers together. You had to have easy entry and exit by buyers and sellers. And you had to have effective competition, basically thick markets, lots of buyers and lots of sellers. In 2003, the FCC took some more concrete steps. They established different categories of leasing. And in 2004, they set in place methods to reduce the approval delays, how long it took them to approve transactions. And now these spectrum markets in theory can work, at least by the FCC's rules. You can lease spectrum, you can sell the rights, you can subdivide it spectrally, geographically, sort of anything you want to do. And I think it should be viewed as more or less a big success by the FCC. Some people think that secondary markets have not succeeded at all, but that's not the case. In terms of magnitude, there are thousands of trades every year, hundreds of leases. And in terms of how much this is not a perfect comparison, but every year since 2003, there have been about 10 billion megahertz pops traded just in the PCS spectrum. But by comparison, in the 700 megahertz auction in 2008, they released about 18 billion megahertz pops. So that's a lot of spectrum sort of shifting around in markets every year. Now, megahertz pops, of course, is not a very good comparison because it matters where you are in the spectrum band and so on. But it gives you an idea that these markets are sort of working in some sense, and I think the FCC should be given a lot of credit. They've reduced the delays in how long it takes these things to these trades to be approved. And really are now more just it's almost as if firms just notify the FCC rather than have to wait for approval in those cases. But it's not that these are working perfectly at all. There are still lots of problems. It's really difficult to get information. There's the universal licensing system. The FCC actually has all this data in its databases, but it's nearly impossible to get at if any of you have tried to use that database. The trading platforms, they're still very new. Spectrum Bridge is an example of one that's working to bring buyers and sellers together. And the transactions costs are still really high. So there's a lot of spectrum trading hands, but probably if these barriers were in place, we could have a lot more of it. So that's a very quick overview of where secondary markets are today, at least in the commercial space. And So now we'll go to Harold and Duffus, and we'll hear about their proposal for Secretary of Markets and Federal Space.
I thank you all for coming. I also want to thank my panelists. As you may have gathered, the distribution of these papers went out fairly late, so I appreciate their forbearance. When we think about the coming spectrum crisis that people talk about, we should remember that this is actually a sign of enormous success in spectrum policy. And that a great deal of that success is owed to two changes that we made and embraced in the 1990s on how to distribute spectrum access. On the one hand, we went to auctions for exclusive high-power licenses. That created the cellular revolution that allowed people to build out these national networks, invest huge amounts of capital in the expectation that they would have interference protection, stable platform that they could build on, and that has been phenomenally successful. At the same time, we also embraced low-power, unlicensed, flexible, low barriers to entry, encouraging a lot of innovation and people coming up with all sorts of novel ways to do it because it was open and available and anybody could play with it. These two methods have reached a point now where they are so successful that users of both methods, those who use a lot of unlicensed, technical community, wireless mesh networks, and in the licensed space, need more. And in fact, they have discovered that in many ways these systems are complementary to each other. We like to talk about licensed versus unlicensed. In fact, as evidenced by AT&T putting up a hotspot in Times Square in order to take some pressure off its licensed network, we see these work well together. But there are still market demands that are not being met. There is tremendous pressure to get more out, and as we've heard from Larry just a few minutes ago, the idea that we can simply shuffle things around easily in federal spectrum without worrying about the ability of the federal government to meet the needs that we all, as citizens of the United States, want the federal government to meet and meet well, that just can't happen in a way that's going to meet the coming needs on its own. What we propose is a way to take the best of both of these access systems, the flexibility and the accessibility and the low barriers to entry of unlicensed, combined with the interference protection and the ability to use higher power in licensed, and create a new way to bring spectrum to market, very suited to complement both systems and very suited to those in the current spectrum market whose needs are not being met. That includes a lot of industrial users, a lot of local government users, a lot of wireless ISPs who would like the advantages that come from license, but who can't afford it and can't find access to it, and who want the flexibility to structure systems the way that unlicensed does. The proposal that we have set forth tries to take into account the concerns that Larry mentioned with regard to federal spectrum. It has to work with the way federal spectrum is allocated. It has to be available immediately when federal agencies like the FAA or law enforcement need it. Fortunately, technology has now advanced in a number of areas where we can say, this is technology that we can do today and we can build this kind of a system. What we've proposed is to take the white spaces database system, where you enter the characteristics for a particular geographic area, and come up with a set of rules that a device communicating with that database will obey, so that it transmits without interfering with the other operators. The mechanism for immediate recall, if you will, of spectrum on an as-needed basis that the FCC has approved in the 700 megahertz band for public safety, so that there will be sufficient 700 megahertz spectrum available for public safety. And layer on top of that the ability to conduct real-time dynamic auctions that is now a standard feature of internet advertising. So while I certainly would agree with what Larry said, is that this is a new proposal, it will require some There is tremendous opportunity for this to be used in the private sector as well as in the federal spectrum. But this goes beyond theory and beyond what is possible, and really to something that we believe, if the federal government were to embrace it and to move forward with it, is practical to implement in a way that is consistent with federal needs and is also respectful of national security.
I'd like to thank Harold for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about the sexy part of the paper, the mathematics. The model that I put forward for estimating revenue to the Treasury from a dynamic secondary market allocation system is very preliminary, is a way of opening the discussion rather than what I would satisfactorily call a fully fleshed out econometric model. In particular, the coefficient of determination, kappa r squared, for the regression equation that underlies the estimation, while at 0.8 is pretty high, it still leaves about 20% of the variation in price between the comparandum licenses are the basis for generating the estimates unaccounted for. I'd like to thank Dr. Wallsten for giving me a couple of suggestions from an earlier version of the paper, noting that there was significant difference in the economic situations between the three options I used as the basis for calculation, that's the 66 and 86. He suggested adding a dummy variable for option 66. I did this and increased the kappa r squared a little bit, but not very much, and exhibited problems of collinearity with the CMA dummy variable, which is a function of the fact that so many CMA licenses were allocated in option 66. The other major problem with the model, actually two major problems with the model, is that I do not take the situation of financial markets into consideration in estimating revenue. This is straightforward because the problem is intractable. If I have a way of doing this to my satisfaction, I'd be sitting on the beach in the Caribbean with a daiquiri, having picked up a couple of $1 billion from the investment banks I sold the operationalization to in my Nobel in Stockholm on the way to that beach. It's literally that kind of intractable problem. So I will simply say that it is likely under current financial market circumstances that the estimates are slightly overestimated. But given the fact that 20% of the variation of the comparandum prices isn't accounted for, that probably leads to a little underestimation. So as a ballpark figure, it works out. Finally, what we really need in order to economically evaluate dynamic secondary markets is a stochastic dynamic model of the markets. This would allow us to calculate exactly how much the federal government would make. Certainly there is adequate reason to believe that it would be substantially more than direct auctioning of these of the spectrum, precisely because, as a matter of theory and empirical observation, dynamic secondary market allocations involve taking immediate snapshots of a market. You have immediate information about correct pricing. Auctions such as the FCC have run always involve forecasts with respect to the development of price structure over time. We can be reasonably assured that it is more economically efficient to allocate the spectrum on the basis of an immediate market, which is resolved instantly by the dynamic allocation process, than by the auction process, which in the case of the FCC has frequently led to the warehousing of spectrum. This allows for the immediate efficient economic use of spectrum on a very quick basis.
I will just add a very quick translation of all of that for the non-economists in the room. We know that there are issues with the model that we've used. We recognize this at the beginning of the discussion, but at the same time, we are extremely confident that the federal government would make money from secondary auctions. And critically, we are reasonably confident that, in fact, the federal government would make more money through through the dynamic system that we've proposed than through the traditional clear-out federal bans to auction for in the way that the FCC traditionally has. This, we think, is an important point in the debate because, as we address in the paper, there is a peculiar paradox that while the FCC is forbidden by law to consider auction revenue, NTIA is required by law to consider auction revenue when thinking about spectrum allocation. So we think that this is an important point.
Let me make one last comment. To try to give you an analogy that everyone can understand, the difference between a dynamic secondary market and an auction is the difference between the way a spot market, say dealing in petroleum, allocates prices, which always generates more revenue than long-term contract operations do. So that's the analogy to keep in mind. It works very much like spot market.
Should we just go down the road?
Sure.
Borrow your mic. Thanks. Let me briefly say I'm very supportive of this approach and the project that Public Health is trying to get more secondary use of secondary markets and more the use of secondary markets in the federal government. On the paper on transparency, I think it's an excellent suggestion. Zero-based budgeting of spectrum for federal aid would be a great idea. It's got a political problem, which is getting the agencies to agree to it. But my one tweak to the paper is to suggest, and it wasn't clear from the quick read I had of it, whether the budgeting was in terms of spectrum or in terms of dollars per spectrum. So even if it is for the spectrum allocation that they're requesting in each appropriation, there should also be a dollar amount attached to it, even if it's not real money. It at least provides the transparency of knowing what the value of the resources are that are being consumed. For the opportunistic leasing paper, again, the comment that Larry Strickland made I thought was appropriate, that this should work in the private sector as well, so we'd love to see it working there. There is a constitutional problem that wasn't raised that I think is really important. Again, this comes from my days as an analyst at the Congressional Budget Office, which is that Congress controls the budgets of federal agencies, and they won't give up that control of the purse string. So if the federal agency is going to do something that raises revenue for the general treasury, there's no great incentive to move mountains, to either clear spectrum or to be cooperative even in an opportunistic setting. If the agency is going to benefit from its participation in the secondary markets, you're going to violate the constitutional separation of powers, and that'll never go anywhere. And that's a fundamental problem that those of us who have been looking at this have been struggling with. I've been struggling for 15 years, and don't have an answer to it. So how do you create the incentive for the agency to cooperate when they can't really capture the value of their actions? But what I was really after to comment on was the economic analysis in the appendix to the second paper. And here's where my heart sinks. I am supportive of the idea of secondary markets. This analysis doesn't support that. It is fatally flawed twice over. Once on a conceptual level, once on a methodological level. The conceptual flaw is that they measure as a premium for secondary markets over auction the value that the licenses are traded in the secondary market over the value of those same licenses traded or sold for at auction. So you sell a license for a certain amount, you see it trade later for a higher amount. That difference in their analysis is attributed to the fact that it was in a secondary market and not in an auction. And the presumption is, had it been sold in a secondary market originally instead of an auction, you would have gotten that higher price. What they in fact are measuring is just the simple change in the value of the spectrum over time. So take the MNDS auction in the mid-90s, which is now the VRS allocation. What was sold there was the cheese in the Swiss cheese, the less valuable pops in the BTAs around P35 licenses. In the mid-90s, they sold for one price. They look at transactions that include the P35s now, the valuable part of the spectrum, up through today, see that the price has gone up. There's been 3 or more rule changes. What was originally auctioned was one-way video service. It's now a 2-way broadband service at local power or any of those bands. It's just a different thing with a different value. What they've picked up is the new value of the spectrum. And it speaks not at all to the difference in value between secondary markets and primary auctions. The methodological problem is how they measure the price of the spectrum. In the paper for AWS1, and I'll just try to give this example and leave it at that. In their paper, they report that the average value of AWS1 spectrum was 18.5 cents a megahertz pop. And the way they get this number, as I understand, is they take the dollar per megahertz pop price of each of the licenses sold in the AWS1 auction, and then just do a simple average of those. So you're averaging the Northeast REAG 20 megahertz F block price equally weighted with the Des Moines, Iowa CMA price. And that's just methodologically wrong. The correct answer is that in the AWS1, $13.9 billion was spent on 90 megahertz of spectrum that covered approximately 286 million people for 26 billion megahertz pops of spectrum. So the 14 divided by 26 roughly is about 55 cents a megahertz pop. And that's the value in the auction. So the numbers that they use to measure these changes are just not, they don't contain any meaning to real value. That said, I do think that the proposal in the paper is a good idea and will gain money for there's a strong argument that it will gain money for the government, not because secondary markets are more valuable than auctions when you have an apples-to-apples comparison. It's because secondary, the opportunistic secondary market will allow you to sell spectrum that you could never sell at auction because you could never find the right to sell it. And in that sense, it will be a great step forward policy-wise. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. In our various activities at the FCC over the past 3.5 years, Google has emphasized a number of principles that we think should help guide policymakers as they look at spectrum management. The first and foremost is data. There should be a data-driven process that we need to actually have all the information and a comprehensive inventory of sorts. So we're very pleased, of course, on the Hill, now the FCC, that efforts are underway to make that a reality. We've also talked about the need for transparency. We have to have an understanding of what the data actually shows. We need efficiency, which means the most uses of the spectrum possible, as well as flexibility, which is the most varied uses possible, given what individual companies and other entities want to use the spectrum for. And finally, a balance, a mix of government and non-government uses, and a mix of licensed uses. And as Karl mentioned, even our good friends at AT&T have a newfound appreciation for the uses of unlicensed spectrum as a complement to their own spectrum holdings. So in my view, the paper does a nice job actually of laying out the benefits of secondary markets and how these markets can help serve many of these principles going forward. The paper does capture some of these challenges, of course, and Assistant Secretary Strickland noted another one this morning, this notion that, of course, individual federal users actually sort of lack a kind of absolute license and control over the spectrum that they otherwise have access to. And this sort of lack of property rights, in a sense, makes it more difficult to try to come up with market-based mechanisms to unlock more value for the spectrum. The paper reminded me of some recent economic literature on the nature of markets and few of you may be familiar with this. It's the New Institutional Economics School. And what they basically talk about, the basic thrust is that there's some people assume that markets are just kind of born, they just kind of are created out of thin air, which is of course not the case. Markets are facilitated, right? They are actually engendered and fostered in many cases by government mechanisms, whether it's property rights laws, whether it's communications laws, right? So as rights are created for individuals to be buyers and sellers in a particular space and time, markets then are enabled to happen. A recent book by a guy named Michael Heller called The Gridlock Economy, I think captures some of this quite nicely. Interestingly, it's a book that was praised by both Professor Larry Lessig and by John Thorne at Verizon. So it seems to me something must be there that's worth thinking about. And what Heller talks about is that, we have many of the familiar arguments over the so-called tragedy of the commons, right? You've got sort of this common resource and open access. The challenge is how do you manage that in a way that benefits most people. But there's also something he calls the anti-commons, which is the notion that you have too many who own too little of too much. And so in his view, when property rights are spread too thinly, and then at the same time allow for the full exclusion of others to use those property rights, we have a fragmented gridlock system that tends to choke off innovation and growth. He points as a couple of examples to airport runways and to thickets of patents, patent rights. And a third example he actually discusses at some length is our nation's airwaves. And so the challenges he sees is to find the socially optimal level of resource use of our airwaves to avoid the peaks and valleys, right, the extremes of spectrum overuse and underuse. He discusses the need to unlock the spectrum grid by creating certain tools, such as greater transparency and enabling some of these rights to be reassembled. So I think, as I was reading his paper, it seemed to me that a lot of the things that Harold's talking about is a nice parallel here as you try to import the right kinds of market incentives and mechanisms from the private sector into the government world. This notion of more transparency, of giving people their actually more rights in the airways themselves, but also the ability to assemble those rights, right? So it's not that you have too many, basically, with control over too little, but that you have an ability to assemble these rights in ways that allow for maximum trading. So we certainly think the secondary markets are an important tool here to do this. I also agree with the paper's premise that the real-time dynamic auctions of spectrum can be one very useful tool to unlock the secondary markets by borrowing the best attributes of both the licensed and the unlicensed regimes, as Bill points out. As the paper notes, Google, in fact, saw confirmation back in the early summer of 2007 that we could employ a very similar kind of mechanism if we, in fact, were to be successful in winning the C block in the 700 megahertz auction. And more recently, we've been working hard on the geolocation database that the FCC has indicated is necessary in order for the TV white spaces to move forward. And again, the paper points to both of those as demonstrating that the technology is actually here today. It's not some fanciful dreams. It's actually a reality that is there now. And the challenge, of course, is the technology works. Now we need something that's more difficult than technology, which is political will, to actually make it a reality. So anyway, I think Harold and Professor Rowe should be commended on this paper and further the dialogue in this area. Thanks.
Thank you. Kathy Brown from Verizon. A preliminary remark and then 3 points. First, I congratulate you, TG, and Karl, for assembling us on always new ideas, so that's a good thing. And a word I think about Larry's presentation and to you, Karl. I was quite impressed with his clarity about what it is that folks are doing and thinking about at NTIA. I spent some time at NTIA. I understood the Office of Spectrum Management. It was always a little tough to know what they were doing over there, even when I was there. And I congratulate you on being so forthcoming about what the analysis is right now that's going on to do what are very difficult tasks. I mean, I think Larry laid out pretty well. For NTIA, there's a lot of customers with a lot of issues and a lot of interests that get into the mix as to how you actually get to a fuller use of this valuable spectrum. So on the substantive side, first, I too got the paper late, but Harold was good enough to give me an early draft. I took a look at that, and we only here digested as well as we could. So at this point because we've got a lot of work to do, all of us, to even understand where we are. That said, one, I think that it's important to put new ideas on the table and to start to push the boundaries of how we think about things. So I'm always intrigued by some new thoughts in this area. I think Larry's caution about, and he was making this point as to transparency, but I think one can make it as to dynamic markets and dynamic auctions. And that is, on all of this, we do have location issues, right? And it's not just that there's a white space, but what's around the white space. So you obviously have issues around whether you can even get to places that you can auction off. Number two, dynamicism in itself suggests that things are changing. And not only is the availability of these spaces change, but also the time needed for which they are available, and also the power needed in that space. All of those variables, it seems to be, make this whole notion of dynamism complex, as I think everyone agreed with. And that complexity brings both costs and financial costs, but also focus costs about how you get there. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. I'm just saying that there are real cautions around going down a road that is so complex. Second point, and that is the demand. And I hope, Chris, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and I'll leave it to you since you're in the business. But just two observations here. I think one wants to understand what the demand for this kind of spot market would be. And I think that I don't necessarily understand it. I think I have in my mind two examples where at a younger age with a lot more enthusiasm, I thought maybe these were things that one should do. And I think about the whole Enron broadband market that I remember at the time thinking how fascinating that all could be, that one could have what was basically a spot market for the use of that capacity and to see how it worked. It didn't work. The second issue was my own foray into low power FM that some of you may remember. I still have scars on my body around that Bill Kennard thought, and I think not wrong about this, that there were some unused airwaves there that ought to be used for low power FM. We had interference, arguments of the yin-yang on just using this kind of spectrum for what we believe would be a community use. Looking back on this, actually, there are actual operating licenses out there, despite the Congress saying, no, you can't ever give those licenses out. Remember that battle. But I think if we're fair, they're very niche. They're very niche, and they're very community, and I wonder if they'd ever make money. So just in terms of what the demand is for this kind of find a spot, use the spot, for what amount of time, to do what with the business case, I think all of that needs a lot of discussion. Third point. I think that the issue of secondary markets is crucial, and that Scott has actually teed up what I believe our focus ought to be. And Harold, I believe this notion of dynamic markets ought to be rolled into the larger question of how to make a secondary market work, both in the commercial space and in the government space. I think there is some good. Scott has a paper on how the market worked in the 90s. Again, this was a Kennard commission that said we needed to establish a secondary market. From the evidence we've seen, the market was very transactional. I think we have to now look at the imperfections of how it worked and to see whether we can actually improve it and to actually start talking about to what end, right? To what end do we need the secondary markets? Depending on where you stand is where you sit is where you stand on this. For the commercial users, of course, they want to see spectrum that is laying unused, start to be used, but for a value. Those who own that spectrum would like to have some ability to make decisions around value propositions, whether it's better to sell or keep it and use it. The federal spectrum users, I think, have opportunities here to actually use, perhaps with a change in the law, some spectrum that might be available, or to put on the market spectrum that they are not using, which would would allow them to look at more efficient uses, perhaps even going to a commercial ban. Some of the discussion around public safety certainly had been around those notions. And then I think there's this question of how business models. So clearly, the Verizon business model is one that is nationwide, multiple, millions of users, needing spectrum that goes across the nation. Other business models clearly are small, garage opener kind of things, and all kinds of other small uses of spectrum. All of those business models, I think, have a place at the secondary market table, but I think we have a lot of work to do on this to take these markets and what has formed over the last decade into something that is usable for a very different marketplace that I think we all want to see to become more robust. I think that this whole dynamic issue should be part of that larger discussion. I don't think we should go off and focus and spend a lot of time, all of our time, if we say it may require some time, on a complex new thing, but that should be part of building on what we started in this whole secondary market area.
Thanks, Scott. I'm definitely in favor of many of the points that Harold and Greg and the other panelists brought up. The one thing I'd add is that we at Spectrum Bridge we're firm believers in a private sector secondary market solution. That said, these discussions kind of remind me of a conversation I had with my mother a few weeks back. She asked me, so what is it your company does? And I thought about it for a second. And I was like, well, we sell carpet remnants. Long pause. She's like, isn't that hard? I was like, yeah, but, there's a lot of things that we're uniquely positioned to do to monetize them. And in many respects, this discussion is about those, carpet remnants, whether it's shag or Berber, and try to monetize people's odd lot shapes. This Spectrum Bridge business really came out of the genesis of this was my colleagues founded a company called Mesh Networks before, and which has become one of the leading networking standards globally for mobile ad hoc networking on license, but it was being applied to very many license plans. And one of the biggest inhibitors to their growth was, you have a client say, hey, I love this, it works great, this particular application or use case, but I'm concerned about I'm concerned about maybe interference or security, et cetera, so I'd like to use license. Well, we go out and try to find a particular license band that covered a specific geography, whether it's an airport or campus or some ribboned area. Like, sorry, I can't find that piece of spectrum for you. So we thought there could be an interesting opportunity in creating some type of spectrum marketplace. Well, we've been pretty successful at that. We're probably the largest neutral spectrum aggregator in the country, having a few billion megahertz pops on our exchange that we buy and sell probably tens of millions of dollars a quarter to a number of what I would consider sort of private wireless networks in industries like utility, transportation, even most of the carriers are our clients. But again, they're buying these carpet remnants that cover their particular areas. Well, it does fill a need, and one of the things that we've learned is that there's this huge imbalance between there's a lot of supply here, and there's a lot of demand here, but there are two different parts of the band in many cases, and the big issue a lot of our clients have is I either don't have enough or it's not in the right area. Well, this brings up sort of another analogy in terms of spectrum allocation. I almost liken it to the air traffic control evolution of those types of systems, where aviators realize that there are a bunch of commercial flights flying across the country, and when they first started out, they had a big map, and the airline pilots would call in and give their lat long coordinates, and people would push around on a stick the little model planes. Well, and that's in many respects where spectrum allocation policy has been for the last century and is today. But where it needs to move is to where the current air traffic control analogy being a dynamic, real-time, multi-dimensional coordination, command and control coordination system that with, sure there's human intervention in there from a policy override perspective, but in many respects it's automated. Well, the technology is here today to do that. One of the areas that we're now focused on is keeping white spaces, which is a great sort of segue into this future opportunity in terms of dynamic spectrum allocation that can be used for not just unlicensed, but any number of licensed spectrum that's currently deployed out there. And in many respects, if LaGuardia can get a plane on the runway every 15 to 30 seconds, well, how come we can't better utilize sort of the existing secondary market spectrum out there? And this new technology, this new dynamic paradigm, I think, is where things need to go. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Karl Nebbia from NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management. I want to thank Gigi and Karl for inviting me this morning. I noticed I did not get the introduction that my boss got as being smart and nice. We actually think of him as smart and good looking. We're not quite so sure about the nice part. But with Eddie and I here, we're both more one-dimensional. So you'll have to figure out which of those dimensions we fit today. The first thing I want to mention, I think that the issue that we're talking about is a very important one in looking at the spectrum in days ahead. If I take the band range that Larry described earlier and expand upon it just a little bit and go down to 225 megahertz, which is a band edge, and up to 3.7 gigahertz, and refer to that as the beachfront. Right now, the federal exclusive portion of that is right about 18%. The non-federal exclusive is over 30%, and the share is over 51% of that total now. So the federal agencies have interest in the federal exclusive portion, and the shared portion, that's a total of over or almost 2,400 megahertz of that total, about 69%. They have some interest in. But in looking at that, one of the things I think it's important to note that of that almost 2,400 megahertz, about 700 or somewhere over 1,700, involves radar or radio navigation infrastructure. So as we talk about moving systems, we're presented with a much more difficult case than we've had in the past, in that most of those radars or radio navigation type systems have been built for bands where the specific propagation signal works best. Some of them, for instance, are used to penetrate foliage, so they are in certain bands. Others to go longer distances. Some of the air traffic systems want to eliminate ground clutter issues and so on, and they're designed for certain bands. So I think as we look ahead, we do have to acknowledge the fact that the traditional approach of relocating people is going to be a much greater challenge in moving these. So if over 1,700 of the total that we're concerned with involve these types of systems, that's fairly significant. Other portions of it involve satellite systems, which of course have long lifetimes also, not so easy to move. So we are going to have to look at new approaches. Harold in his paper has certainly, I think, opened up some new avenues here. But as we discuss these things, one of the things that I would really appreciate if we could do, or hope that we can do, is agree on one thing, and that is the language we're going to speak in our business. And nothing about English or French or signing. What I'm talking about is spectrum speak. That's the language that we in spectrum management use. And we've created definitions to terms like allocation and assignment and allotment that mean a lot to our business. And what we find is that as people dabble in this business, they use English, not spectrum speak. So to them, the word allocation often means me giving a frequency to somebody, when in fact in our business it doesn't mean that. We allocate spectrum, broad ranges of spectrum, to radio services, whether it's radio navigation or mobile and so on. At NTIA, we assign specific frequencies to agencies to use, similar to a license, but it's our authorization to do that. And for us, the word allotment means it's more or less a management technique in that a couple bands that the federal agencies use, we've designated specific agencies to be essentially the first in on certain frequencies. So as people are looking for channels to be on, they go to a channel first that their name is attached to, and if they run out of them, they go to a channel that another agency's name is on, and so on, and they progress through that type of interaction. We do not allocate any spectrum to the agencies. So there's not broad pieces of spectrum, broad geography that we just said, DOD, this is yours, go and do what you want with it. We do not handle the spectrum in that way. In fact, we assign them case by case as they come in, we coordinate them, and so on. So it's important to understand there are no bands allocated to specific federal agencies. Very important as we start looking at this. Secondly, one of the things, as we started talking about secondary markets, I mean, I was really ready to get on this aggressively because we've talked about secondary markets for years. And for us, what that has always meant is the suggestion that an agency could take what it's been given and lease it and make money off it. And first of all, there is clearly that budget issue that the folks who give out the money in the government are going to have issues with agencies out there making money off of spectrum. And in fact, we'd probably get lots of new frequency assignment requests if they knew they were going to get money off of the spectrum. But at this point, they have absolutely, and then we will